Is the USA's role as the global reserve currency and ultimately their role as the global superpower of the world under threat? Some people think yes and some people think no. But in order to understand what's happening today, we have to take a look back at the historical context that have led us to where we are now. So in this video, we're going to have a look at some of the most significant historical events that give plenty of context to our current situation. The best place to start is 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World War II is coming to an end, and a bunch of delegates from around the world are having a meeting to discuss what to do moving forward. And as a result of this meeting, the global world order would never be the same. You see, the Bretton Woods system introduced two very important new institutions. First of all, the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. The IMF is designed to aid countries that are having issues with money and debt by working with these countries on their internal policies and structures and trying to fix these issues. And secondly, the World Bank. So supposedly, the World Bank was created as a lending institution to lend to developing nations and increase prosperity and ultimately peace. So let's have a bit of fun with this one in the comments, guys, because I know that there's going to be many different opinions about the IMF and the World Bank. So I'm interested to know your thoughts. Do you think that these institutions are forces for good or forces for evil? So along with these major institutions, one of the products of the Bretton Woods system was that the US dollar now became the de facto global reserve currency. This required international currencies to be pegged to the value of the dollar, which was pegged to the value of gold at $35 an ounce. This also meant that the US dollar became the main currency held around the world in central banks or in global transactions and many other things. The Bretton Woods system would collapse in the 1970s, but it would leave a lasting legacy with the World Bank and the IMF, and also the US dollar as the global reserve currency still to this day. In 1971, without so much as a warning, President Nixon announced that the US dollar would no longer be pegged to the value of gold.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
According to Yale Insight, when the Nixon administration came into office in 1969, they realized that the world economy had grown very, very big. Everyone wanted dollars, so the Federal Reserve was printing lots of dollars. As a result, there was 4 times as many dollars in circulation as there was gold in reserves. The rate of $35 an ounce of gold was good in 1944, but it hadn't changed. So by 1971, the dollar was really overvalued. That meant that imports were very cheap and exports were very expensive. We experienced our first trade deficit since the 19th century. We were experiencing employment problems for the first time the US started to talk about losing competitiveness. This decision by Nixon would change the world in the click of his fingers. All of a sudden, the Bretton Woods system was no longer. What this now meant is that the US currency was now a fiat currency. According to Investopedia, fiat money is a government-issued currency that is not backed by a physical commodity such as gold or silver, but rather by the government that issued it. The value of fiat money is derived from the relationship between supply and demand and the stability of the issuing government, rather than the worth of the commodity backing it. Most modern paper currencies are fiat currencies, including the US dollar, the euro, and other major global currencies. Now, one of the big risks with fiat currencies is the risk of inflation if governments print too much of it, which we all know that they don't mind doing from time to time. Because the currency is not pegged to a certain commodity, it has no intrinsic value. Keep that in mind. Moving on to 1973 now. And in 1973, the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, stopped selling oil to America and other nations in a bid to stop them from supporting Israel in the Arab-Israeli or the Yom Kippur War.
If you want more for your trade, go see Cal. Better deals are never made. Go see Cal.
Cal Worthington was a Dodge dealer in Los Angeles.
One day we were selling cars like crazy, and the next day, disaster. The oil embargo came along, and couldn't sell big cars at all. As a matter of fact, people that had bought big cars were bringing them back and leaving them on the lot. So here, I don't want it. I won't be able to buy gas for it.
This was at a time when the US imported 83% of its oil from the Middle East. The idea was that these countries would reduce their oil production by 5% each month until the Israelis withdrew from occupied territories. So you can understand that this OPEC embargo was incredibly alarming for the powers that be. According to the Federal Reserve history, on October the 19th, 1973, immediately following President Nixon's request for Congress to make available $2.2 billion in emergency aid for Israel for the conflict known as the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, instituted an oil embargo on the United States. The embargo ceased US oil imports for participating OPEC nations and began a series of production cuts that altered the world's price of oil. These cuts nearly quadrupled the price of oil from $2.90 a barrel before the embargo to $11.65 a barrel in January 1974. In March 1974, amid disagreements with OPEC on how long to continue the punishment, the embargo was officially lifted. The higher oil prices, on the other hand, remained. It goes without saying, and as we've seen in recent years, we need oil to survive and certainly to maintain our way of life. So you can imagine this oil embargo in 1973 was extremely alarming for the powers that be in the West, and in particular in the US. With this embargo and these price hikes, these oil-producing nations were getting filthy rich whilst the USA was having glaring weaknesses exposed. This needed to be resolved quickly. In 1974, President Nixon sent William Simon, the Secretary of Treasury, over to Saudi Arabia to strike a deal with the kingdom. This was hailed as a wide-ranging military and economic agreement that both said herald an era of increasingly close cooperation, in an article by the New York Times from the 9th of June 1974. Now, this agreement saw the USA buying oil from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and also providing them with protection, military aid, and equipment. In return, the Saudis would pump billions of their petrodollar revenue back into US treasuries and finance US spending. And guys, there's a lot more context here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out a PowerPoint presentation to my email list. This PowerPoint presentation will have all of my notes from this video and also all of my sources, so you guys can go read up on it yourself. So if you go to my website, www.rattlesnaketv.com, and you sign up to my email list right at the top of the website there, then you'll receive an email with this PowerPoint presentation. So hit that link pinned in the top of the comments or in the bio. So moving into the 21st century, and there's a new player on the scene. The US has signed various regulations to globalize trade and offshore the manufacturing from America to China. This was great for the prosperity of China, but it destroyed the US manufacturing machine, and it also has eventually left the US in quite a vulnerable position. So whilst China has become very powerful, this was something that was created and allowed by the United States.
The outcome of the debate on permanent normal trade relations with China will have profound implications for the free world's trading system and the long-term growth potential of the American economy.
And many think that the USA should be getting very tough on China, as Donald Trump was doing when he put tariffs on China to try and mitigate the effects of these disastrous neoliberal policies.
But we have one particular problem, and that's China. But we have a trade deficit, depending on the way you calculate, of $504 billion.
And I think that everything is kind of put into perspective when you think about it like this. The rise of economic power in China has raised the people's living standard to the point where they have a much bigger middle class. So in a sense, they're kind of a victim of their own prosperity. And whilst there is a lot of cheap labor still happening, don't get me wrong, it's not exactly the low cost and low skilled labor that got them to this point. So what are they doing? Offshoring it to Africa. This kind of reminds me of like an older brother who gives his hand-me-down clothes to the middle brother, and then the middle brother gives his hand-me-down clothes to the youngest brother. But then eventually the middle brother and the youngest brother grow up and they're old enough to get a job and buy their own drip. Now, as far as I can tell, this investment from China into Africa could have some very beneficial impacts on the economies of these developing nations in Africa, similar to the economic impact that manufacturing had on China. But obviously with that, there are serious concerns coming from the West about the expanding global power that China is now harboring.
I've been saying China, 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 China.
And China make no bones about their ambitions. They want to be the superpower of the world, which shouldn't surprise you, and you can't really blame them, because the role of a government should be to get the best result for their country and to increase prosperity of their country as much as possible. And they have an agenda, a roadmap to the year 2049, when they want to become the global superpower of the world. And this date is significant because this is the date that marks the 100-year anniversary of when Chairman Mao completed the Chinese Communist Revolution and established the People's Republic of China, which was beforehand just the Republic of China, which is the government that now governs Taiwan. The difference between China and the West is that China play the long game. Now, one of China's major goals, and a very publicized goal, is, as they would call it, the reunification of China and Taiwan. Now, many geopolitical analysts are saying that a conflict is imminent. There are various timelines being thrown out there. Some think it's going to happen really soon, and others think that it will happen towards the end of the decade, closer to 2030. But amongst most experts, there's pretty much a unanimous consensus that the CCP will eventually make a move for Taiwan. And the only thing that's really standing in their way is the US and the Western world, and specifically the potential implications of global sanctions and other international pressures. This could be absolutely detrimental to a country already having some major crises of their own, according to American geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan.
Which countries should be very concerned about the ratio of young to old?
The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago, and by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers, and by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million.
That's wild.
It's beyond terminal. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure.
And if you're interested in this topic specifically, I'm actually going to be in Taiwan in the next few weeks, and I'm going to be doing some stories regarding these topics. So make sure you guys follow my journey on Instagram and Twitter. It's at JakeRattleSNK. That's JakeRattleSNK. And hit that notification bell so that you guys never miss a beat. And while we're here, if you guys haven't already, and if you're getting value from this content, don't forget to chuck a like on the video. It really helps me with my algorithms. And subscribe to the channel if I've earned that honor. Okay, now let's talk about BRICS. According to the Economic Times, BRICS is an acronym that started as BRIC in 2001, coined by Jim O'Neill, a Goldman Sachs economist, for Brazil, China, India, and Russia. Later in 2010, South Africa was added to become BRICS. Goldman Sachs claimed that the global economy will be dominated by the 4 BRIC economies by 2050. BRICS is a group of nations that holds 41% of the world's population and 24% of the world's GDP. So, what are their plans? Well, their main objective is the economic cooperation that will lead to development in their own nations. But they also have some international aspirations to change the economic landscape of the world. They want to create institutions that will challenge the global hegemony of the World Bank and the IMF. Hence the development of the NDB, or the New Development Bank, which was created to do just that, funding infrastructure projects throughout the developing world. They are also intent on challenging the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And one might suggest, especially through recent events, that the US dollar could be on tender hooks at the moment, and I will explain that very soon. So BRICS have announced plans for their own currency in a bid to break away from the US dollar and protect themselves from international pressure such as sanctions. If they could replace the US dollar as the global reserve currency, or at least reduce the dominance that it has on the market, then sanctions would not be nearly as effective, and this would be tremendously helpful if China were to try and reunify Taiwan, which they will undoubtedly try and do, potentially quite soon. Fast forward now to February 2022, when the war between Russia and the Ukraine officially begins. Or so they tell us. This led to the USA and other countries imposing major sanctions on Russia, which had a mixed bag of results. And seeing as though Europe was dependent on Russia for 45% of its gas imports, One might argue that the biggest losers from that situation was countries like Germany, who were completely dependent on Russia, and even England, whose energy prices have skyrocketed since then. And of course, Nord Stream pipeline. Rest in peace to Nord Stream. Now, the Russians were kicked out of SWIFT, a secure messaging system that allows banks to make international transfers to one another between 200 plus countries. Russia was the second biggest user of the network, and when they were cut off from the system, they were forced to look for alternatives. Some of the options included SPFS. SPFS is the Russian equivalent of the SWIFT financial transfer system developed by the Central Bank of Russia. It provides messaging for local and cross-border transactions. And another option is CIPS. It's the Chinese alternative to SWIFT that came about in 2015 that's designed to increase the usage of the Chinese renminbi or the yuan, and is a way of countries like China and Russia being able to avoid the impact of economic sanctions such as being kicked off SWIFT. Now, with all that said, let's go through some of the more recent developments. Now, things are moving very quickly, but these are things that we should know about. Like we discussed, China and Russia are in efforts to bypass the dollar. Japan has started buying Russian oil, the same Japan that joined the US in sanctioning Russia. Well, they sanctioned them, but they left oil and gas out of those sanctions. And now they are going for that cheap oil. And Japan absolutely needs oil, and they themselves don't actually produce any. And trust me when I say, having lived here for the past 6 weeks, that an energy or a food crisis would absolutely cripple Tokyo. If I were Japan, I would be doing the exact same thing. I would not be risking my country's absolutely crucial energy security to contribute to Western sanctions on a war that is happening in Ukraine that at this time doesn't have anything to do with me or my country. No way. Especially considering some of the rather eyebrow-raising aspects of the war, which is probably a video for my locals channel. Now, furthermore, Brazil and China have signed an agreement to drop the US dollar and start using the Chinese yuan. And for those of you who aren't exactly sure, a unit of renminbi is a yuan. Just as the pound is the basic unit of the sterling, renminbi and yuan are often used interchangeably. Now, even more events that have happened recently. South African officials were in Russia recently for talks of a new global order. India and Russia have established the rupee-ruble trade mechanism, where India pays in rupees, Russia earns in rubles, leading to a boost in bilateral trade. Russia and Iran are in the process of launching a gold-backed stablecoin, which is a digital alternative to the US dollar. Now, there are currently 114 countries that are actively pursuing central bank digital currencies as we speak, with pilot programs having been rolled out already. And if you know what a CBDC is, and if you've done some research into that, then you may just have lost a bit of faith in humanity, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking just that. And many banks are currently moving away from cash. So it appears as though, and I'm not thrilled about this by any means, unless we are somehow able to pull the brakes, we are headed for central bank digital currencies. Now, the last of these developments is the most significant one in my opinion. Could Saudi Arabia join BRICS? Conveniently, because they start with an S, it would still be called BRICS. BRICS. This would be an enormous development, and considering how badly their relationship with the US has declined since Joe Biden got into office, it wouldn't be that surprising anymore. This all begun after the death of Saudi Arabian journalist Jamal Khashoggi, when Joe Biden started badmouthing the Saudis, calling them a pariah state, and saying that he would exact justice on them during his campaign for office. Biden actually requested that OPEC ramp up oil production, and they just flat out refused, and then further flexed on him by ignoring his threats about consequences for this refusal, and they are now considering joining BRICS, which would potentially give BRICS the leverage to overtake the Western liberal world order. So is the US dollar's position really being challenged? Ray Dalio says that the reserve currency changes every 94 years or so. Now, as you can see, global supplies of US dollars are shrinking, with other currencies rising. But it's not all pointing in this direction, however. Many experts around the world, which is where I get my information from, needless to say I'm not one of those experts, are actually still very bullish that the US dollar's position is not under threat, and it's too established and too powerful to be challenged. Or at least that it would take a considerable amount of time for any meaningful change to be able to happen. But what would it mean if this did happen, and if the petrodollar status was challenged, and if other countries, especially the OPEC nations, started trading oil in their own currencies and ditched the US dollar? Well, people in the US would get far poorer. There would be trillions of US dollars floating around the world that are all of a sudden becoming more and more useless, causing hyperinflation and seriously devaluing the value of the US dollar. And considering that the US government has been printing money at staggering rates over the last few years and are already suffering from inflation, the effects of this could be absolutely devastating. Furthermore, in an extreme situation and a little bit down the line, there would be a giant shift in global power that would see other countries, most likely from the BRICS family or the Arab oil exporting giants, becoming the new superpowers of the world. And one of the aspects of this that is particularly concerning to myself is that due to the heavy-handed approach of the US in regards to their foreign policy over the years, they have made no shortage of enemies, and enemies that would likely jump at the chance to exact some revenge if given that chance. Time will tell. And make sure to let me know what you think in the comments, guys, because obviously this is such a complicated and nuanced topic that there are many different opinions about pretty much everything that I've said. And in the next few months, I'm going to be doing videos about what's happening with banks in the West, and also some strategies about what you guys can do to protect your wealth in terms of investing in precious metals and cryptocurrencies and all of that sort of thing. And once I start my podcast, which is not too far off, I'll be hopefully getting some experts in those fields that will be able to share with you guys some serious value. So come check me out on social medias and all that good stuff. If you want to watch another video, click right here. If you want to subscribe to the channel, click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.